Welcome to Exploring Santa Cruz, a bi-weekly program on KSQD 90.7 FM, with alternating hosts Jean Kratzer and Matilda Rand. My name is Matilda Rand. Today we're discussing employee-owned businesses, and we're doing this with Ross Newport and from Community Printers and Maria Cadenas from Santa Cruz Community Ventures.
Yes.
And Ross, why don't we start with you? You're a longtime member of Community Printers. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with a workers-owned business?
Sure. I'd actually worked in a law co-op for about 6 months, thinking I was going to become a lawyer, and realized I didn't like law that much. I was going home with a stomachache every night, and my girlfriend at the time had started working with 6 other people in a little print class where everybody learned how to print, and they did printing for community organizations, and then all worked other jobs. And they invited me to come join them. And we started to build the business up from this little hole in the wall to now being the largest commercial printer on the Monterey Bay. There's 35 people who work at the company. We have a 20,000 square foot facility. We do offset printing, digital printing, wide format printing, fulfillment, all sorts of different kinds of work, all tied in one way or another to print. And the shop is a for-profit entity. The board of directors of Community Printers.
Let's give Maria a little chance to talk about it. And we'll talk about, because I want to know about the structure, because it's fascinating.
Okay.
But Maria, why don't you tell us how you got to be involved with Santa Cruz Ventures and Community Ventures? And, you know, you have a very interesting resume.
Yeah. Well, my connection to ventures really comes down to people and community. Mm-hmm. You know, I have a sense of working together to create something amazing, and I had the blessing to end up in philanthropy for many years. So I was working with a community foundation that was looking through a social justice lens, and it was very much similar in the sense of democratizing philanthropy. It was community-based. Donors, individual donors of any amount will contribute, and they will have a say on what would be invested in making that community change. And then I moved to corporate philanthropy, and thinking that maybe we can take these values that were about community-led things into a corporate space or business space, that you have the footprint of the business both in their labor and treatment and others, and then in their community giving, how can they work together? So that took me there. And in that space, I was working in agriculture and rural communities across the Americas, and I saw the same things over and over again, this concentration of poverty, and this unequal distribution of the wealth that was being created through the extraction of assets, water, land, you know, from poor communities. And the poor community didn't get richer, but the distribution of the wealth of those extracting those assets were. And it worried me. And I thought there has to be a different way of using business to create well-being in our communities. And ventures to me was a space that had been around since the 1990s, right? With this idealistic thing of how do we create economic justice? And I had the same question, the same impetus of trying to figure it out. And that's what brought me to ventures, is the idea that we can do something better and work better in creating communities that are thriving.
Wow. So let's go back to the fascinating structure of Community Printers, and then I'm sure the two of you have lots to say about worker-owned businesses. But tell us first about how you're structured.
Sure. Well, when we got started, we were primarily doing printing for community organizations and nonprofits and environmental organizations, and we very much identified as that's our people. So we set ourselves up as a nonprofit, and then the IRS came along and said, wait a minute, you're a print shop that's competing with other print shops. You can't be a nonprofit. So they actually made the suggestion that we create Community Printers Incorporated, a for-profit entity, and then have the stock held in trust by a nonprofit foundation. So it's sort of a little bit like the relationship between, say, Ford Foundation and Ford Motor Company. So the nonprofit holds the shares of community printers in trust for the betterment of the community and to facilitate us being able to run a worker co-op. And then the workers at community printers have full control over the day-to-day operation of the business, everything from setting the wage structure to making determinations about hiring to making determinations about borrowing to buy a press or things like that.
Wow. That is amazing.
Yeah, yeah, we think so.
So how did that connect with you? I heard you say about the importance of worker-owned
Right.
businesses.
So the idea really is that you can have a democratized way of distributing your business equity. Really, is how do you make sure that there's a say on what's happening in the business, that sense of ownership, and also building wealth more equitably across those, making that business possible, not just the big CEO getting the 400 times the salary than the person on the front lines, right? So finding that equitable and transparency of building that wealth. So we started looking, and I'm saying ventures, we started looking at our worker-owned co-ops as a vehicle to providing wealth building and democratizing the economy so that it is local. So you put your money where your life is, basically, right? That we as a community put our money where our life is. And if you're a worker, you're putting and taking and building the equity within the community. We also know that local businesses have a higher return for the benefit of the community, both in terms of taxes that they pay to local municipalities and also to the wages and other things, expenses that they use at local level. So we were looking at worker-owned co-ops as a vehicle for wealth building because when we looked at Santa Cruz, traditionally you think you're going to make money if you're buying a house and you're going to build your equity. That's how you're going to retire. Your home, but you can't afford a home in Santa Cruz. Not only is there not enough homes, period, but the average cost of a house is $800,000, and who can afford that? And there's not many. People can do that. So we needed different ways of rethinking if we're really thinking about building communities where people can thrive and live, not work 3 jobs, right? That they can take the Saturday and go to the park, that they can go to a movie and not worry about being able to pay something. We needed a different way of making money, and worker-owned co-ops as a way of democratizing and building wealth equity through business as a vehicle of doing that.
So you can tell a lot about a company based upon how it structures its compensation. So, for instance, at Community Printers, between the lowest paid worker and the highest paid worker is about 2.5 to 1. When we got started, everybody made exactly the same, but as we started buying bigger and bigger presses, we needed to start to be able to recruit people who were in the trade, who knew how to run those presses, who could share their knowledge with us. So we created some separation of wage structure to try to support that. We said we want to create a liberal vacation policy because you put the workers in charge. And what did they say? Well, how about 5 weeks paid vacation? So we have it. We early on, when we had very little money, we still felt it was important to have health insurance. So we've had health insurance since the 70s. We realized that every time someone went on vacation, it created a crisis because we were short a person. So then we came up with strategies around cross-training so that it wouldn't be a crisis anymore when people were on vacation. And that ended up leading to a dynamic engine that allowed us to grow and take advantage of opportunities that came along, because there were then multiple people who know how to do different job functions. So a sales opportunity comes along that requires more people in the press room or more people in the bindery, and we had talent who could be able to do that. I think Community Printers has succeeded for over 40 years because of that collaborative approach, not in spite of that collaborative approach.
Right.
So.
It's about building community, right? And looking at the return on investment differently than how much money did we make, right? It's about you really spoke about values, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's about the values that you have in terms of compensation, the values that you have on how you take care of your workers, the benefits that you provide them, and the quality of life that can afford to do that while you're providing a quality service that is needed in the community. That to me speaks to a sense of living the quality of life and living the life in communities that we want to live in, right? And when I start looking at economies or business, and you can get very high intuitive with really a lot of lingo, at the end of the day, we got to demystify the idea of what money is for and what business is for. They're just vehicles that we have let them really try to guide our life when it should be the other way around. Business and money should be vehicles to the type of lives that we want to have. And how do we have a shift in culture and mindset on how they function and how they're building each other and how they're using our resources, both our labor, our productivity, and our natural resources to create communities that we want. Again, worker-owned co-ops have been around for a long time. And they're not a new model. No. But they're being used differently and by different communities today for the same purposes that they were all that long time ago. When you look at the national data, the fastest growing group is Latino-owned worker-owned co-ops or employee-owned businesses, immigrants, and women. And they're going to this model because it's a way of building wealth, because they're not finding other ways to do it. And it's in community, you're not doing it alone, which is almost contradictory to the individualistic American dream. I'm going to succeed on my own bootstraps. I'm going to make it. It's like, no, actually, when you do it in community, when you're doing our values and you're creating this sense of who we are, then it leads you to different business structures. And it may be a worker-owned co-op, or maybe, and within that, there's so many flavors on how that gets developed. But it is a sense of purpose of creating community. And that, again, is what guides the intent of, if we are looking at using the economy or business as a vehicle for the communities we want to live in, then those values need to be, in a way, democratic, accessible, and as equitable as you can make them. And worker-owned businesses are a vehicle for that.
So community printers inherently is a little bit conservative in how it makes decisions. I mean, conservative from a political standpoint. I mean, cautious. Because when the employees have a say, they want to make sure that every investment is really well thought out, because everyone's jobs are on the line. So there's a lot of thinking about what's the next step, what's the next investment. Some of the co-ops from the 70s that aren't around anymore, I believe failed because they hadn't developed a culture of innovation. Times are always changing. The things that people want, the kinds of printing that people need are constantly evolving. And so that conservative attitude that says, let's make sure we think this next step out really clearly, has to be balanced with a culture that exists within the organization that is constantly saying, what's next?
Right.
How do we refocus, for instance, our business, as people are moving more and more to reading the news on their phone instead of in a newsletter or a newspaper? What's our next step? And we talked as a group and started to develop packaging solutions, started to develop solutions for producing signs and displays. And that came out of 35 minds coming together and talking and getting comfortable with taking certain risks and taking certain chances.
But that's interesting, because you're talking about a level of almost business savvy, right? This balance between risk and action and time, right? And when you have a group of 35 people making those decisions, it's going to slow it down, but you still need to have the processes to move forward.
You are listening to Exploring Santa Cruz on KSQD 90.7 FM. Today's topic is employee-owned businesses. I'm Matilda Rand with my guests Maria Cadenas and Russ Newport. We just talked about how co-ops make decisions and how they can become business savvy. Let's return and listen to Maria, who discusses what is needed in Santa Cruz to help co-ops.
That we don't have enough localized technical assistance and business support systems for those that are looking to develop new co-ops to think outside of a hierarchical decision-making process that still allows them that space for innovation and that space for action and flexibility. The other piece I think that goes around that is the scale of the businesses that are being formed through the worker-owned co-ops. You're not looking, I don't know of any necessarily global-sized worker-owned co-op, right? So there's a sense of scale that makes sense, that lends itself to functioning within community, right? It's not about local versus global, because we are in a global system. But I do think that you can definitely invest in localized economies or regional spaces that create a cyclical way of making sure your capital or money that is made here stays here and doesn't get out. And again, it goes back to what is the business savvy of the employees, what is the employee development that we have, what is the ownership things that we are looking at. And for us, when we're looking at ventures and we look at this landscape, we know that there's expertise on the ground of people and businesses like community printers who have that expertise. How do we multiply it? How do we scale it so that others can learn from it? And each co-op's going to have their own culture.
Sure.
But again, it's technical assistance and business support programs that I believe we need to start looking at investing and bringing into town.
There's a really interesting business in the Bay Area, Arizmendi Bakery. I don't know if you've heard about them, but it's a network of, I think now a dozen bakeries. Each one is a co-op, and then there's a Arizmendi administrative office that helps to initiate new co-ops. So they've figured out replication.
Yes.
Right. Whereas most other co-ops that I know, they might be good at running their business, but they actually haven't figured out yet how to replicate that business into new models. And so they have, for instance, financial services that are in place that all of the Arizmendi bakeries can take advantage of. They have training programs not only around decision making or finance, but also literally around baking and helping people to learn the craft.
There's actually another model that I heard around childcare providers. Now, they're not doing it almost like a franchise like that bakery is, but they are supporting other childcare clinics that are being developed and using the same thing. You have a central administrative business co-op that then lends its services to the up-and-coming childcare providers that are coming into town. So I do think that there's scalability in leveraging resources, but in both cases, you have a use of existing assets at the community level, whether it's the knowledge of baking or the knowledge of providing care for children or the knowledge of printing. So you're not bringing it from the outside. It's already here. It's already strong. You're just finding vehicles to strengthen it and build into living wages and businesses that can thrive.
Yeah. So most years, we have a profit, and so we do profit sharing. But I can think of 2 periods of time in those 40 years where we faced intense challenges. One of them was right after 9/11, when literally every business that we were doing work for stopped doing business for a while. And the money wasn't coming in anymore. We were looking at how were we going to make payroll. And we all came together and said, what are we going to do? And the decision was to cut our wages, but it had to be more nuanced than just doing across the board percentage decrease, because the people who were making less on the pay scale couldn't afford the same kinds of cuts that the people on the top end of the pay scale should make. So as a group, we made the decision that the pay cut was on a sliding scale. So the people who were making more were actually paying were taking a bigger percentage cut. And then we had cutting of hours as well that we had to do. This was pretty draconian times that we had to survive. So we cut hours, but we didn't want to cut the hours of the sales staff because we had to go out and find work to be able to get things back up and running. So then we came up with nuances like that. And then we had to do the same thing in 2008 when the economy tanked. And print shops were closing right and left, 2008, 2009, 2010. And everyone came together once again and said, we're going to figure out how to save the business. We're going to figure out how to support each other. And around 2009, 2010, when everyone else had cut their workforce, we kept our workforce intact. And then when opportunities came along, we were the first shops who could say, we can do that.
Yeah.
We still have the trained staff. We still have the structure. We even invested a little bit of our savings into developing out some of the new technologies and the new products that we felt that we needed to expand into. And I think it's maybe one of the things I'm most proud about community printers is how we've come together in those challenging times. You know, take a lot of pride when we can afford to pay ourselves a bonus. We all love it, but I just think it says a lot about the people that I work with, how we've dealt with those difficult times as well as those really good times.
You know, what that makes me think of in a tangent way is access to capital and ability to get funding to alleviate cash flows in tough situations. And I know that for worker-owned or just co-ops in general, finding lenders or available capital is harder because of the perception of risk of who gets to make the decision in case something, that loan doesn't come to fruition. And one of the areas that we are looking into seriously is that we need to increase the availability of community capital in the region. Not only capital in general, but capital that is raised locally and distributed locally for local businesses, where the return is not just on the money, but in cheering up and building the local ecosystem of the businesses and the type of businesses that we want. So when you talk about disruptions in flow that are outside of your control, 9/11, that decrease, what is the capital available to support some of the cash flows, and knowing that for co-ops and worker-owned co-ops, it's harder to achieve them. And so we need to create vehicles where the lender that is willing to take that risk, which actually data shows us it's less of a risk, but it's fomenting that perception versus reality, and having lenders that can specialize in lending to co-ops and finding the vehicles to do that. And that's something that from Community Ventures we're committed to exploring.
So we started in 1977. I think the Santa Cruz Community Credit Union started the same year, and they were really interested in trying to figure out how to seed small progressive businesses in Santa Cruz. And we got a $2,000 loan from them in 1978, I think, and it was the first business loan that they did. And $2,000 isn't that much money, but it allowed us to buy an old press that put us to the next level from a business standpoint.
Right.
And that access to capital was huge. It really helped us along. Having access to inexpensive space is a huge component to small businesses of any kind, co-ops or any kind of small business, to be successful, because you just don't have a lot of money initially. And we took an old pulp molding factory and divided it up into a lot of different pieces and brought a bunch of different businesses collectively together so that each of us could get a little piece of a space that was affordable for each of us. And I think that was a little piece of our success, was that ability to access the inexpensive space by coming together with a lot of other organizations to create that space. And then one other really important piece is we had created an association of co-ops back in the 70s and the 80s, and the executive director of that program had a lot more business experience than many of us, and he came in when we were negotiating the lease on our space and said, you need to write an option to buy into your lease if it goes up for sale. And we kind of thought it was funny because we couldn't envision ourselves possibly owning property. But lo and behold, our landlord passed away, the property went up for sale, and we were able to buy it for something very close to what we were paying in rent. Okay. And we wouldn't have known to do that without other people with expertise to kind of guide us in that direction. And that's a piece of how we survived post 2008 was that we had by that time built equity in the business. So,
Right.
so I'm suggesting this idea that you have of what are the different things that you can do to seed things, be it money, knowledge, and then I'm trying to add to the list cheap space, because
Cheap
I really
space.
believe that cheap space is a key to helping people get businesses off the ground when they don't have a lot of investment capital.
Yeah, so almost, it makes me think of the incubator models that have been done in Watsonville, for example. You have a Pajaro CDC that invested in this plaza where they incubate businesses, right? And they also invested in the kitchen incubator space. So those are physical spaces that help launch businesses. Alba, for example, has their how do you launch a farm worker to a farmer on a model down to Salinas. So I like the idea of finding ways to provide access to land or buildings where people can provide or co-ops in this case can have the ability to thrive. The other piece that I think we should consider in Santa Cruz is the reality that we have a baby boomer community that a lot of them might be single owners or proprietors, right? And it's time to transition or retire. Where do those businesses go? It's hard to sell them, but there's an opportunity to look at conversion of existing businesses into worker-owned co-ops and facilitating that through technical assistance, business savvy, and capital as a way of expanding the community space around worker owners.
I can't believe it. Our time is almost up. We have 1 minute left. The two of you had not met before today. So
No, but I have a new best friend.
It is amazing how this topic brought two people from, in a way, different worlds, but at the same time, the same world, about building community. So I really want to thank you, Maria, and I want to thank you, Ross, for being here today. We had on the site ways to get more information about Santa Cruz Community Ventures, and you, of course, and also about community printers. So I want to thank you, and I want to tell people at home, I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I didn't have to say much because the knowledge is right there, and you really informed me and educated me more about worker-owned or employee-owned businesses. So thank you so much, and I hope your conversation continues, and I hope that people at home will continue thinking about this as well. You've been listening to Exploring Santa Cruz on KSQD 90.7 FM. To give your feedback, email me at mrand.exploringsantacruz@ksqd.org. Again, mrand, R-A-N-D, mrand.exploringsantacruz@ksqd.org.